Good afternoon, all. In the interests of time and making certain that Mike has the opportunity to share his work fully, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, but please avail yourselves of all of the luncheon opportunities in the back of the room. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kate Cagney. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan. I'm so glad you could join us today for our Insight Speaker Series. This is a forum for ISR faculty to share their research to inform the public good and also to form this room so that we all know, right, the kind of work we're engaged in, and we can learn from one another, right? And hopefully it gives us great ideas for our own research. I just want to say a few things about ISR. We have over 300 affiliated faculty who conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics, including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, and health. A full schedule of Insights talks is available on the ISR website, as well as recordings of past talks in the series. We'll post a video, right, Catherine, of today's event there as well, so you can share it with others who weren't able to join us right now. So let me tell you a bit about today's talk. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Mike Mueller-Smith, well known to many of us. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and faculty associate at the ISR Population Studies Center. His research focuses on measuring the criminal justice system in the US, as well as its impact on the population. He's director of the Criminal Justice Administrative Record System, or CJARS, a data infrastructure project in partnership with the US Census Bureau, which seeks to collect and link extensive amounts of criminal justice microdata with social economic data that are held by the Census Bureau. So I think it's a really terrific example how we think about bringing various data resources together to bring new insight into the kind of contemporary social science questions we address here at ISR. Today, Mike will share from CJARS to show evidence of the looming retirement crisis stemming from the aging generations of Americans who've been impacted by mass incarceration. So I think a really interesting intersection of thinking about the life course, our changing age structure, and thinking about incarceration and the structure of it internally. He will review recent research to measure the population of retirees with criminal records and the scope of their economic, and I'm imagining also social vulnerability. So we often take questions at the end, and we'll do that, but Mike has invited us to just chime in. I think that comes from econ rules, right, where there's more of a shout out if somebody has a question. So I invite you to do that so that we have a really nice, rich discussion. And when I was speaking with Mike about the introduction, and then he said, you can kind of just go ahead and introduce me. He said, just let the research speak, right? And you said something like, it's not about my ego. And then you paused and you said, and that's unusual for an economist to say. So I appreciated that and thought you all would as well. So with that, let's welcome Mike to the room and today, and very much looking forward to it. Great, take it away.
Thanks, Kate. Such a pleasure to be here and share this work with you all. So my name is Mike Mueller-Smith. I'm going to be talking today about criminal justice development and well-being in old age. This is joint work with Jen Goliak, Jonathan Edelstein, Bill Gale, and Brianna Sullivan, and doesn't represent the views of the US Census Bureau. And all the evidence that we're going to talk through today is been through proper disclosure review. So normally when we think about crime and studying crime dynamics, the implications of criminal justice policy, we're usually focused on a young population. We usually think of this as being a young man's game, there's a known fact, one of the best known facts of criminology is there's an age crime profile, that the vast majority of crime that occurs in the United States happens from individuals who are either in their teenage or early 20s years. In separate work, we found that about 92% of individuals who ever become involved in the justice system will have their first contact before the age of 30, and more than half will have their first contact before turning 18. So it's a little bit odd to be thinking about, elderly or aging populations in the justice system. This isn't kind of a typical combination of populations and policies that we consider in research. Why are we looking at that in this project? Well, there are millions of individuals who have criminal justice records. There's been a substantial increase since the 1980s and 1990s as a result of changes in state, local, and federal policy. And in the background of this figure is the phenomenon known as mass incarceration, This actually represents the 50-year anniversary of what was kind of determined as the start of mass incarceration in terms of uptick in the rate of imprisonment in the United States. This is just one way of conceptualizing the expansion and the growth of the justice system. Many people in the United States have criminal records, either misdemeanor or felony convictions, who never spend time in prison or jail. And we think that these types of interactions with the justice system have meaningful impacts on their future trajectories, whether that's escalating to further recidivism, hampering labor market productivity, a whole range of things. So as there's been this wave of justice-involved individuals that are growing, we're actually right on the precipice of the first kind of individuals caught up in this new generation. And by new, I mean what was happening about 50 years ago in the way that we approach criminal justice policy, nearing retirement age. And so we know that from this work that's been done on criminal records and incarceration, that this can lead individuals to face economic challenges. This may lead them to make it more difficult to find and keep legal work. They might not qualify for Social Security benefits. They might not have pensions. They might not have social safety nets to rely on. And so our previous approaches to supporting this aging population might not work going forward. So what are we doing in this project? What we're going to do is integrate procedures, which I'll talk about quite a bit more in a few slides, with data from the Census Bureau and the Social Security Administration's microdata to describe first, what does old age look like for those with criminal histories? This is a really challenging thing to characterize because think back, these are individuals who are probably getting involved early on in life when they were in their 20s or teens. And we're trying to fast forward 40 or 50 years later to describe what their life is like as they reach old age. So if we want to think about putting this data together, it's a pretty intense data requirement where we need to have snapshots today of well-being linked with what was happening 50 years ago. We could think about using something like survey data, but particularly in this population, you might worry about issues of social desirability bias, limiting the accuracy of that information being recorded. So part of this is just describing for the first time through putting together novel data sources what old age looks like for those who have faced interactions with the justice system. Second, what we're going to do is forecast the growth rate in the share of retirement age population who have criminal histories. And this is pretty reliable because of what I was talking about, that the majority of people who are going to eventually become involved in the justice system or ever become involved in the justice system will have their first experiences before turning age 30. And so what we can do is do some forecasting based off of realized cohort level interactions with the justice system and try to fill in those gaps of how many more people from a birth cohort are having their first interactions, in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, so that we have a sense of what share of individuals for the next 20 or 30 years arriving at age 62 will have criminal records. Where the majority of this, even though it's called a forecast, it's actually realized in the population. Finally, we're going to leverage a change in the enforcement of what was known as the fugitive felon rule that was enacted as part of PORA to measure the causal effect of safety net assistance from the Social Security Administration, SSI, and OASDI on the well-being of people with felony records between the ages of 50 to 70 years old. And this diff and diff style analysis will help us evaluate the causal benefits of expanded safety net spending on this population in the coming decades. So basically, well, here, let me go through what we find, and then I'll kind of give my perspective on why we're putting these three different pieces together. One, we find that justice-involved individuals unsurprisingly face significant economic vulnerability in old age, even compared to similarly matched unskilled groups. The share of the retiring population is going to grow quite significantly over the next 2 decades, close to doubling, so that I think the peak will be roughly in the early 2040s, where we'll go from about, we'll get to about 1 in 4 individuals reaching age 62 will have any form of criminal record. About 1 in 2 Black men will have a criminal record. You might think, oh, this is too broad. Let's think about something that's a bit more serious, although I think there is credible research to suggest that things like misdemeanor convictions and charges can have lasting impacts on individual trajectories. You might look at just felony convictions, and here we find that roughly 1/10 of the population will have a felony conviction reaching age 62 by the early 2040s, and more than 1 in 3 Black men. Extending SSI and OASDI eligibility to the aging justice developed population really helps improve their lives in a meaningful way. It shows really significant declines in poverty rates and reliance on homeless shelter and drug treatment facility usage. They're leading healthier lives, reducing disability rates by about 2 percentage points, reducing nursing home usage, and decreasing 3-year mortality rates. They're more likely to live in intact family units, so they're more likely to be living with a minor child and remain married. And this is all based off of kind of what we in economics refer to as a first stage, or the actual change, because not everyone who's going to have a experience a change in eligibility will actually take up the program. This is off of a contemporaneous change in take up of these safety net programs of about 4 percentage points. So if you think about that relative to the declines in poverty, it's about a 1-for-1 trade-off. For every individual getting access to the safety net benefits, you are lifting them out of poverty and changing their life in a very meaningful way. Now, this doesn't change everything for this population. There are a lot of kind of outcomes that are essentially just baked in at this point. We don't see any changes in future labor market trajectories or criminal justice outcomes. And giving somebody access to SSI or OASDI isn't going to resolve the fact that they still have a criminal record and likely face significant discrimination on the labor market. So why do we put all of this together? I mean, I think thinking broadly about the project, what we're talking about is there's going to be this big growth in this population that we know is going to be economically vulnerable, that will rely on benefits that they are entitled to, which will cost the federal government a significant amount of money. There's been plenty of history where when justice-involved individuals rely on costly services and governments are facing constrained budgets, they're on the chopping block. And so I think it's really important to have this final piece in the project to understand if we're going to debate restricting access to these benefits in another way, other than through the fugitive felon rule, these are the costs that we're going to be incurring in the United States from cutting off benefits to these individuals. All right, what is CJARS? CJARS was founded by myself and my collaborator, Keith Finley from the US Census Bureau in 2016. And it's a joint data infrastructure project between the University of Michigan and the US Census Bureau. What we're doing is building a novel platform to modernize research and statistical reporting on the US criminal justice system, including event-level criminal justice data with nationwide scope, tracking outcomes across key milestones in the justice system. So information on arrests, criminal court proceedings, periods of correctional supervision, whether that's institutional or community-based, with the capacity to link with individual level survey and administrative data at the US Census Bureau. This is like a really major change in our capacity to understand the scope and impact of the US criminal justice system compared to prior efforts. A lot of federal reporting really focuses on aggregate measures in a given year and isolating specific stages of the justice system without the capacity to track individuals as they move across space and time, or even think about contextualizing what led to their involvement in the justice system with their socioeconomic background, or what the implications of their treatment by the justice system has on their future trajectories. So we're really making, I think, meaningful change in the frontier of what's possible to learn about this area of critical social policy in the United States. Over the last 7 years, we've been hard at work collecting data, and I want to acknowledge a bunch of people in the back of the room who are part of the CJARS team who make this possible. We have data now from over 2,500 counties. We have data from 38 states with at least a decade of coverage in one domain of the justice system that together represent 84% of the US population. We have more than 35 billion raw lines of data that together represent 215 million criminal justice events for 44 million unique individuals. This has been a lot of work, but I think it's worth it because we're really starting to better understand just how far the justice system reaches. So, you know, thinking about some of these numbers, it's a little bit hard to kind of appreciate because the differences across the United States in terms of our depth of coverage, but just to like think about the state of Michigan, where we have very extensive data coverage going back to the 1990s. The state of Michigan has a little bit over 9 million people. Does anybody want to guess how many unique individuals we see interacting with the justice system in the state of Michigan in our data? So about off of a current base of 9 million people.
1 million.
1 million. Any other guesses?
3.
3. We observe about 4.5 million people involved having contact with the justice system in the state of Michigan. Now, it's not exactly fair to say that means half of the Michigan population is justice involved. That's including individuals that today may no longer be alive or have moved out of the state of Michigan. But it is kind of astounding just to think about the scale at which this is happening. Okay, so let's get back to the focus of today's talk. The exercise we're going to do here is relatively straightforward to think about. We have this phenomena where we embarked on a really sharp change in the way that we used and deployed the justice system in the United States starting about 50 years ago. And given what I already talked about in terms of the age crime profile, this is going to affect different birth cohorts differentially based off of whether or not the expansion of the justice system intersected with their peak prime age years, based off of kind of their vulnerability of becoming justice involved, just because we know this is largely concentrated during late teens and early 20s. So what I'm showing here is for basically the set of data, the earliest birth cohort that we're showing in this presentation, although we have more thorough historical data that we're going to push that we haven't disclosed yet that goes back a bit further in time. But for the earliest data that I'm going to be talking about today, we can look at the birth cohort born in 1952. Their peak age crime years between ages 18 to 30 line up between roughly 1970 and 1982. Right now, this is going to be intersecting with the start of mass incarceration as we now understand it. So obviously there's some increase happening, but this is a largely different experience compared to individuals who reached retirement age last year, who were between the ages of 18 and 30 in roughly like 1988 to, I think 1980 to 1992, right? You start to see, and that's not even at the peak, right? This is still in the ramp up. We could think about somebody who might be at the peak in terms of their vulnerability of becoming justice involved in the environment, the policy environment that they face. Those are going to be folks that were born roughly in 1982, around when I was born, who today, you know, are approaching maybe their early 40s, late 30s. They aren't going to reach retirement age until mid 2040, 2044. Right? So we basically have this phenomena of policies that were made, policy decisions that were made 50, 40 years ago that are going to be manifested for the next 20 to 30 years. There's essentially nothing we can do about that. The population faced this environment, became justice involved, and now we're going to be paying for the consequences of that in the years to come. So one thing that we have to deal with in the project is that even though the vast majority of the involvement, let's say for somebody born in 1982, has already been realized, right? Their peak age crime years were between the years of, let's say, 1988 and 2012. That's data that we have. Like we already observed all of that for that population. But then there are these remaining years after the 30s. So we can probably get all the way up to their when they turn age 40, but then we have to figure out how many more people from that birth cohort would become justice involved between the ages, you know, while they're in their 50s and early 60s. To deal with that, we estimate a linear model to predict the share of a cohort C with first-time criminal justice event at age A. This is really nothing too fancy. Essentially, all we're doing is estimating the curvature of a concave slope and trying to project out the increasing share of that population that would have marginally more justice involvement compared to where they're at the end of our realized series. This should not feel intimidating. There's nothing really fancy going on here. It's just getting us a few more percentage points on some cohorts. We're only going to do this projection series for cohorts that we can at least see their criminal justice involvement with through age 30. Just because we know that those increases are that there's a lot of people who are having first-time involvement through age 30. We want to make sure that we're characterizing that accurately and not using kind of models to impute that information during those critical years. Now, a problem with doing this exercise is we know that justice-involved individuals have higher likelihood of death compared to non-justice involved individuals. In separate work that I've done, we look at individuals who were released from prison or got a felony conviction right around the Great Recession, and you can look at their risk of death over the next decade, and it's roughly 3 to 4 times higher than the general population. This group, on average, is about 30 years old, largely male, and I think their death rate within 10 years is about 6 to 7 percentage points. It's a very high death rate for what should be a healthy group. Obviously, being justice involved has a very serious, is at serious health risk, either because of the risky health behavior engaged in, whether that might be drug use, or because you might be more likely to be engaged in violence or be the victim of violence. So we have to do a complementary mortality rate prediction model to account for the fact that many of these people who have become justice involved are not going to survive to retirement age. Now that creates a bit of an awkward tension in that from a public finance perspective, this is a savings. These are people that we are not going to rely on public benefits as they reach old age. They're just going to die before they make it there. That's not something that I think we should celebrate, but that is a reality of how this is working. And if we think about taking initiatives to improve the health outcomes of justice involved individuals, that would only suggest that there will be higher rates of individuals reaching retirement age who have criminal histories, which would only expand the potential fiscal crisis that we're facing. So we can put these together to get cohort exposure rates. So these are some of the estimates that we have from this exercise showing all, I want to pause for a second. It makes me uncomfortable as an economist to not get any questions. So does anybody have any questions? Like, I'm very used to taking questions as we go. Yeah.
Not justice system.
Please.
So I have a question about the criminal involved people. Do you also include like juvenile justice?
Yeah, so in CJARs, we do not collect juvenile justice records. That's a really great question. I kind of went quickly through CJARs and didn't go into all the kind of limitations of it. There are really significant legal barriers to collecting juvenile records, and so those are typically outside of the scope of what we collect. We have been working with the Casey Foundation to do some kind of pilot exploratory work to see if there might be opportunities to incorporate some juvenile justice data, but at this time we don't systematically collect that. Any other questions? Yeah.
These all like determine prisoners, convictions, or is there a certain amount of recidivism that people leaving, coming back into the system, rotating?
Yeah, so the estimates that I'm going to be talking about here are purely on the extensive margin. So it's just if you have one interaction with the justice system, or you have 20 convictions against your name, that all counts as a 1 in the numerator. So it's just it's kind of ignoring the intensive margin of how much contact you're having into that. You can see here that we are differentiating by how far into the system you're progressing, whether you're facing a misdemeanor, a felony charge, a felony level charge, a felony conviction, or having spent time in prison. And that's going to obviously moderate how much of the population is having that degree of contact. But in this kind of initial exercise, we aren't trying to get at anything relating to the intensive margin. I think there's really good work to suggest that the extensive margin is something we should be highly concerned about, because just getting that criminal record can be incredibly impactful that first time. And then the marginal implications of additional records, at least in terms of labor market discrimination, are not as substantial. Yeah.
Are you distinguishing between different types of financial impact of like how long sentences are? So if you have people from this birth cohort who may be serving life sentences, for instance, or who will still be serving time by the time they reach retirement age, or are you looking only at people who are serving their time, getting out, and then experiencing economic insecurity, and then are relying on public services other than the criminal justice system in their old age?
Yeah, so the survey data we're looking at will only be for individuals out of institutional facilities. There are very few people who are still in prison at this age. Mainly the folks that you will see in prison, this is going to be a bit of a tangent, but I feel like you guys would enjoy this. The folks that you see in prison in their 60s, let's say, are going to be individuals typically who are serving very long sentences for violent crimes and have done something very serious, likely have killed someone or engaged in some other very, what we consider a heinous crime. Now, the justice system is facing its own kind of internal fiscal crisis. This is a population that it hasn't historically had to serve. And people are talking about issues of long-term care and health needs, where individuals who have, because prisons essentially self-insure in terms of dealing with their health costs, they don't have a health insurance plan that individuals are on. They're essentially paying out of pocket the full cost of addressing the health needs. And so individuals with long-term care issues can cost upwards of at least $100,000 per year. Now, some of these individuals, the strategy that penal systems are taking to deal with this are releasing individuals on compassionate release, with the idea being, well, they're ill, they're older, the likelihood that they will have another justice event is low. I think it's framed as a very supportive policy, but I think underpinning this is really a fiscal issue that they are trying to avoid paying the cost of caring for these individuals. As these people are being released and talking with direct service providers, places like nursing homes and nonprofits are not wanting to get involved at all because of their violent histories and issues of mental health. And so this is now a population that's being released without any kind of service provider besides, emergency nonprofits stepping in to care for them. But talking with people, they can't get nursing home beds for these individuals who are just getting removed from prison. Yeah.
A quick follow-up on that. And imagine you're going to exploit your state level differences, which I would think, right, would relate to things like nursing home beds and availability and even age structure and important differences by rural and urban context. Anyway, just wondering if you're going to.
Yeah, so we aren't going to do anything with geographic variation in this project right now. I think that's a super interesting question. Right now, what we're focused on is the temporal variation. And I think one of the challenges in kind of going geographically as well as temporally is that our historical coverage varies by location. And so our ability to produce these types of curves for each individual jurisdiction is going to be, that's going to push the data probably too far. But that's surely an important thing to be considering because there are histories of very different approaches to the justice system as well as health systems in the United States by state, local jurisdiction. All right, so this is just plotting out for the birth cohort of individuals reaching 2018, reaching age 62 in 2018, what the share would have any charge, which would include misdemeanors and felonies, just to make sure we're all having a common frame of reference. A misdemeanor charge is not like a traffic ticket. A misdemeanor charge will be things like getting convicted for possessing marijuana. A lot of domestic violence charges are misdemeanors, DUIs. Those are the types of things that we should be thinking about, not like Did I get $100 ticket on my car because I overstayed my parking ticket, or I was speeding a bit? So that's going to grow, as we can see here. Now, what I'm really excited about with this new data we've been working with the more recent vintage of CDRs, is that I can't talk specifically about the numbers because we haven't disclosed them yet, but because we have more historical data, we're better able to characterize what's happening in the lead up, because this is just entering midstream while kind of this policy change has already happened. So we're better able to characterize what the prevailing rate was before we embarked on this journey in the United States, to better kind of show kind of what the real growth rate is relative to historical experience. But that's something that's in progress. So you can see this kind of plateaus around the early 2040s as these birth cohorts are essentially, all of their crime years are in this new equilibrium with very kind of extensive and harsh punishment that's been happening. This is going to be seen across any charge, felony charges, felony conviction, and prison. And I know that some of these lines look a little bit more flat because they're all on the same scale, but I promise you they are all increasing quite substantially. Now, this is for every, the whole population together. We can look at this separately for men. So by the early 2040s, about 1 in 3 men will have any criminal charge. We can look at it for women. Women are going to be at a lower overall level, but this is kind of a phenomenon that's been talked about a lot in criminology. They have had one of the largest growth rates in justice involvement, and you can see that characterized here, where it's more than doubling, where in 2018, it's about maybe 6 or 7% of women reaching age 62 had a criminal charge on their record, and it's going to be around 16% by the 2040s. Obviously, we have to talk about race. This is showing the evidence for Black non-Hispanic men. This does kind of similar to when we're thinking about men before. There isn't as much of a sharp increase, although it's really helpful to have some of this earlier data. So I'm excited to incorporate that into future presentations. But the levels are incredibly high, right? We're talking about roughly 1 in 2 Black non-Hispanic men surviving to age 62 will have a criminal record. About 1 in 5 will have spent time in prison. Okay, and this is conditional on survival, right? So if we were to represent these as the share of the birth cohort, whoever had these experiences, whether or not they lived to age 62, these would by definition just be higher because the mortality risk is substantially higher within the justice involved population. White non-Hispanic men, similar to women, lower levels, but higher growth rates. And this is, I think, intimately connected with the opioid epidemic. In other words, it's much easier to see that white non-Hispanic men have really substantially increased their involvement in the justice system over the last decade as a result of the expansion and penetration of opioids and opioid abuse in the population. Okay, so this is going to have serious fiscal implications. There's ample research that documents how criminal records harm labor market outcomes and produce stigma with employers. In addition, incapacitation while individuals are incarcerated would prevent work, obviously, and this both matter because in order to qualify for programs like OASDI, old age and survivors insurance and disability insurance, you need to have 40 quarters of formal sector work for program eligibility. So this might lead individuals to switch into relying on programs like the Supplemental Security Income SSI insurance program, which does not have eligibility requirement based off of your history of work. Why does that make a difference from a fiscal standpoint? Well, part of the reason why they have these reports of work for OASDI is that you're paying taxes to support the functioning of the system when you're working in the formal sector, which then contribute towards supporting the OASDI program. For individuals who are on SSI, they're on SSI because they haven't had substantial labor market experience, which means they haven't paid taxes in yet they're receiving benefits out. Now, as a well-functioning society, like these types of programs make sense. Like that we should have safety net programs in place in order to ensure that individuals aren't living in destitution in old age. But we do have to think about how we actually keep the finances of this working. Even if OASDI eligibility is maintained, low-income individuals likely draw more benefits from SSA than are paid via taxes. And I can show this figure from the Congressional Budget Office, which shows this is kind of not specific to the justice and law population, but in general, thinking about the likelihood that we're going to run out of money to pay Social Security benefits. It's looking at the lifetime ratio of benefits drawn to taxes paid in across different birth cohorts, where this will vary because of differing tax rates as well as benefit levels that individuals are drawing. But basically every quintile in the population, except for the highest quintile, are drawing more benefits out of Social Security than they're paying in. And for the lowest quintile, which is where justice involved individuals likely fall, it's at a ratio of 2.5 times. So even if you you had your felony convictions, managed to navigate the labor market to get a formal sector job, and were working kind of in a minimum wage setting or something like that, you're still paying way less in than you're eventually going to be drawing from the system. Okay. So as I already talked about, criminal justice involvement can impact a range of life cycle outcomes that influence well-being in old age, employment and earnings, as we talked about, health and family structure and household attachment. But little work has studied these issues because criminal records are formed much earlier in life, often decades before reaching retirement age. And so there's this tension between when we want to observe outcomes and when the left-hand side variables, and when justice involvement happened, the right-hand side variables. These are happening, decades apart. We have to find a way to put the data together. So that's what we did in this project. We took ECS respondents between 2006 and 2019, linked them back to their criminal histories and CJARs, where we have decades of involvement with the justice system, depending on jurisdiction. And we are basically comparing those with a justice event prior to turning age 50. And here this is defined as having either a felony conviction or spending time in prison, because that's going to be the population that we're focusing on that were impacted by the fugitive felon rule, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Comparing those to those who have no observed contact with the justice system at the far right-hand corner. And then in the middle, this is a reweighted population where we're adjusting the ACS weights to match on educational attainment. So you can see these two first columns are matching by construction, as well as race, demographic profile, those types of things, to try to at least adjust on observable dimensions to make these populations more similar. Justice involved individuals are much less likely to be currently married at the time that they're being surveyed, although they still have high rates of ever being married, roughly 3/4 were ever married, but only 1/3 are currently married. That compares to about 2/3 in the general population and about 85 to 90% of these individuals ever being married. These skew heavily towards those with less than a high school diploma or high school diploma. Justice involvement itself can interrupt the human capital kind of generation process in completing your educational attainment. They live in slightly smaller households, but not too different. They're much less likely to be living with family members and more likely to be living with non-relatives households, so living with roommates, essentially, at this point in time. They are about twice as likely to be in a nursing home or health facility, about 10 times as likely to be in a residential treatment center, which is a drug treatment facility, and about 20 times as likely to be in an emergency transitional shelter or homeless shelter. So while these are small shares of these populations, the justice involved group occupies a large percentage of individuals who are using these services, which are not cheap. There are about 1/3 of these individuals are living in poverty, much lower rates of household income and personal income. I'm going to speed up a little bit to get to some of the last bits of the analysis. The one thing I do want to talk about is you might say, oh, okay, like it kind of makes sense. These guys are struggling. I say guys because it's predominantly men, but it's not exclusively men. These individuals are struggling. That makes sense. They're probably cycling in and out of jail. That's kind of the wrong characterization that you should be looking at. These are people who probably are unlikely to be justice involved. On average, it's been over 8 years since their last involvement in the justice system. And like 3/4 of them will not go on to have any further contact with the justice system. So this is something that's been in their past, but the consequences, the scars that they bear from having justice involvement still continue to affect their socioeconomic outcomes as they transition into old age. All right, so there are programs to support low-income older adults. There's the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Program. This provides 90% of income for 40% of those over the age of 65, and more than half of the income for 40% of those over the age 65. This is what you are thinking of when somebody says Social Security. You can begin claiming benefits between the ages of 62 to 70. If you wait until a bit older, then you get more benefits per month. If you claim it earlier, you get less. We focus on 62 as this is the earliest age you can start claiming. It's a progressive program, so if you earn more money, you get more benefits, but the increase is decreasing incrementally. And you have to have worked at least 10 years or 40 quarters. There's also disability insurance for those who cannot work due to a long-term disability, like OASI. It depends on time spent in the legal workforce. And then we have the Supplemental Security Income Program that provides a last resort means-tested benefits to low-income, elderly, blind, or disabled adults. If you're over the age of 62, you don't need to have a qualifying disability anymore. It's just for anyone who's over the age of 62 who who does not have a substantial amount of income. The benefit levels are typically near the bottom of the OASDI schedule. So if you had basically barely qualified for OASDI with the minimum amount of earnings, you're going to get a benefit that's about similar from the SSI program. Now, criminal justice involvement can affect your eligibility for all of those programs. So there's a permanent exclusion for disabilities caused by or exacerbated by felonious acts or incarceration. So to give some concrete examples, let's say that I robbed a bank and I was running away and a police officer shot me while I was fleeing, and that shot severed my spinal column and I became paralyzed. That would be a disability that was a result of my felonious act, and I would never be eligible for benefits to support me going forward. Suppose I was in prison, let's rewind, I robbed a bank, I just got caught and I was in prison for that felony. And there was a riot and I got pushed down a staircase and I severed my spinal column and I became disabled. That, even though I'm a victim in that situation, that is a byproduct of my felonious act. The fact that I engaged in illegal activity put me in that risky environment. And so that also would never qualify me for benefits. And that's true whether or not I've paid into the system. People who are currently incarcerated are not eligible for SSI benefits. If you have dependents or spouses, you are receiving OSI, they're allowed to continue receiving benefits while you're incarcerated, but your benefit amount is lowered. And you can't be a fugitive felon, which is what we're going to talk about in a moment. And this is if you're fleeing prosecution or punishment for felony crimes, including owing outstanding debt, which was introduced as part of FORA. The enforcement of the future felon rule, there's a question on the SSI application that asks this question. They also, what was kind of unique, so FORA allowed a variety of different safety net programs to use this rule to disenroll individuals, whether it was TANF or SNAP. SSA was unique in that they, because they're a federally administered program, established a data use sharing agreement with the FBI where they did direct matches to find any outstanding arrest warrants for individuals at the felony level. And they were basically rejecting anyone that matched to an existing felony warrant in the FBI's database. And you could have a felony warrant if you had outstanding criminal legal debt associated with a felony trial that you just didn't pay. That would generate a warrant for you. It's not that you had done something that was necessarily at the felony level, but that was associated with felony level case. So the original rule was that SSA was denying or suspending benefits to anyone with individual confirmed to have an outstanding felony arrest warrant. In 2009, prior to the Martinez settlement, which is the first of two class action lawsuits, we're looking at 58,000 people per year were identified as fugitive felons and had benefits suspended. There were two major lawsuits against SSA, Martinez versus Estrue. Estrue is the administrator of SSA at the time, so this Estrue represents the government in 2009, and then Clark versus Estrue in 2011. And by 2014, the number of suspensions had gone down to only 830 individuals. So this was a massive change in their application of this rule. The first lawsuit argued that SSA was not doing enough to confirm that somebody was actually fleeing, that they might just be unaware that they had an outstanding warrant. And so they agreed to enforce only on individuals with outstanding warrants related to escape or flight. And they had to retroactively pay benefits to those with wrongful suspensions. The second one had to deal with violations of probation or parole, again, that people might not be aware of. What the court ended up forcing them to do is actually calling police stations to confirm that a law enforcement agency was actively pursuing an individual for serving a warrant. And unless they could confirm that, they were not allowed to suspend benefits. And so in some ways, it's like, because SSA didn't have the manpower to actually execute this now, they couldn't just do a merge and just drop everyone that matched. They actually had to do some footwork to confirm that a warrant was there and get the police to actively respond to them to confirm that they were in pursuit. They basically stopped using this policy for the majority of individuals. That went into effect in 2011. They tried to appeal it, but they were denied in 2012. So you can see this in this data, and here I'm showing in the red line the justice-involved population, those with felony conviction or an experience of prison, which implies a felony conviction, as well as the reweighted non-justice involved group. And you can see following 2009, there's kind of an uptick in the likelihood of receiving a benefit, either OASDI and SSI, and that's what we're going to be studying. This largely comes from a major increase in using the SSI program. Keep in mind, these are individuals who are already in old age. They cannot do anything to change their work history to potentially qualify for OASI. Most likely, they're going to be able to take advantage of benefits through the SSI program. All right. We're running short on time. Okay, so we're basically going to do a diff and diff and event study, putting all this data together. Rather than going too much into this, I want to just show you some of the results from this. So this is an event study showing basically a regression model controlling for things like time and place. That's showing the impact on the take-up of OASDI versus SSI. This is just a more formal way of showing what I already showed visually. But this is driven by SSI take-up, where on average, the increase is about 4 percentage points over the follow-up period. There's a kind of a transition period as these cases are playing out. And we think that part of the reason why there's actually a successful impact of uptake in benefits is that because these were class action lawsuits, there was actually organization on the ground to work with individuals to make them aware that they were newly eligible to apply for benefits. Now, mechanically, if you get access to an SSA benefit, you're also getting access to health insurance. And for the purposes of our study, we are trying to differentiate these things. We view this as a package deal of financial benefits as well as getting access to health insurance. And so you can see this here. Unfortunately, the health insurance questions weren't asked prior to 2008, so we only have one pre-period here. But you can see roughly a similar magnitude of increase in public health and health insurance being taken up. Now, the ACA, it's natural to ask, like, is this a confounder, since this was kind of happening around the same time? Here, to look at this, we put the outcomes into a 2x2 matrix, where we look at whether or not you both have an SSA benefit and health insurance, one or the other, or neither. And what we can see is that individuals are moving out of having neither a benefit or health insurance, or just only having health insurance, into having both an SSA benefit and health insurance. What would be a problem with Medicaid expansions is if there's an uptick here, that there are people getting health insurance who aren't also getting SSI. That doesn't seem to be what's happening here. Okay, but it does look like maybe there was an effect in the long run of private exchanges, just as all individuals are talked about as maybe a huge beneficiary of the decoupling of health insurance access from work and private health insurance. The uptick eventually towards the end of the series and take up of private health insurance could be a reflection of that. Now, when we look at results, if you see patterns where impacts only emerge at the very end, maybe we should be concerned that private health insurance is what's driving it rather than any type of SSA benefit. All right, so we're going to look at a bunch of outcomes. I should have walked you through this already, but these big red bars are the means for the justice involved population prior to these lawsuits happening. On top of that is the treatment effect that we're estimating in the light bar, and then there's a 95% confidence interval around that. So what we're seeing here is that there's about almost 40% of justice involved individuals report being disabled on the American Community Survey, and there's a reduction of around, I want to say 2 percentage points in the likelihood of reporting being disabled when individuals get access to or become eligible for these programs. There's a reduction in nursing home usage and dying within 1 and 3 years. And these obviously are at a different scale. Let me just show you a quick event study. This is going to be the only one I show you, but here you can look at the 1-year mortality risk, and it doesn't seem like the private health insurance market is driving this. If anything, this is being realized, you know, during 2011 to 2015, 2016. This is a pretty big impact considering it's off of a base of change of take up around 4 percentage points. No changes in labor market behavior or crime outcomes. I already previewed that. Huge impacts on poverty. It basically cuts the poverty rate in half. The likelihood of living in a homeless shelter or a drug treatment facility in half. And reduces poverty rate roughly on a 1-for-1 basis. So everyone who's getting access to these benefits are being moved out of poverty, which is pretty stunning. As a result, these individuals are living in slightly larger households. They're more likely to be identifying as married in their household and also living with a minor child. One thing that we're working towards doing in future iterations of this is trying to track the outcomes for individuals, for the children and partners of these justice involved individuals. And it might not necessarily be a good thing for the families that their justice involved individuals are remaining with them. That's an empirical thing that we can test. We just need to do a bit more work to track down who the partners and children are of those who are no longer remaining co-residing at the time of the survey. And that's something that we've been pushing forward in other work that we've done. Okay. There's additional analysis by obviously different types of subgroups. We've talked about the spillovers. I'm not going to talk about this anticipated versus unanticipated access to support, although I think that's pretty interesting. In conclusion, I just want to say, you know, the US is going to experience this wave of individuals reaching retirement with criminal records over the next 2 decades. So far, there's been little formal analysis of what this experience will look like, and it's unclear whether or not our safety net is structured in a way to support them. What we're doing in this project is we're providing the first descriptive evidence on this group as they near retirement age. We're formally forecasting the growth rates in this population over the next 20 to 30 years. And we're going to show heightened dependence on SSI over OASDI, which has important fiscal implications. Through analyzing changes in the SSA's fugitive felon rule, we're estimating quasi-experimental effects on the impact of safety net access on older justice involved individuals. And we find that providing access to these benefits, it's improving their health, lowering their use of costly emergency care and assistance, moving individuals out in poverty, and strengthening families and household units. So supporting this justice involved population into and through retirement, it's going to be costly. Like it's not like this is going to be really expensive, but it's going to come with important societal benefits, and we need to be careful in thinking about if we're going to draw back on those support mechanisms, how else are we going to be paying for that? All right, I really appreciate all of your questions and comments. If you want to learn more about integrating CTRs into your own work, it's accessible to anyone. You don't need to work with us to do it. It's freely available through the FSRDC system. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks for the CJAR. A big fan of the what you've done there. Question has to do with the impacts, I guess, of incarceration. You mentioned the high mortality rates in this population. I wonder if you are looking at, or if you have looked at the impact of incarceration on mortality in this population, that certainly when they're not in prison, engage in decisions and lifestyle that are harmful for their health and longevity. And I'm thinking, I'm sure you're familiar with the Swedish study that showed that gave causal estimates or quasi-experimental evidence of higher increased sentence length having beneficial impacts on reducing mortality and improving health. It's a different context, obviously, Sweden. But I wonder if you have anything to say about
so
those processes.
Census and co-authors have a paper out of Ohio that also finds no impact of incarceration on mortality. I don't think like isolating the specific mechanism within the justice system is the goal that we have in this project. I think that can be entirely true. It might be that incarceration for some play a either has no effect or is playing a protective factor. But I think what we miss when we have that kind of soundbite that comes out is that there are other things that are happening in the justice system that are putting individuals at significantly higher risk of these outcomes in the first place. And so maybe it's improving outcomes marginally, but it's missing the first order effect that they're having a felony conviction or any type of conviction. You're severely decreasing the likelihood of future employment, dramatically increasing future recidivism, which itself is often a form of risky behavior that elevates the risk of death. And so I don't think that what we're talking about is in conflict with what you're talking about. I think our goal is trying to characterize the system overall and not getting into specific mechanisms, because I think we kind of lose the bigger picture when we do that. Any other questions? Yeah.
With your data, are you able to look at like effects on? Are you able to look at effects on like families? Like, because I would imagine if you have less access to benefits in older age, it might affect your spouse or your children or.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was talking about again. That's something that we're pushing on right now in this project. We have a paper that's coming out next month in the QJE about the spillover effects of just involved households on the kids and just the prevalence of that. We estimate that roughly 40% of US children grow up in a justice involved household, 2/3 of Black children and American Indian children grow up in justice involved households. And that was a really large effort to assemble almost the universe of data on households and individuals that the federal government holds. So that's the kind of infrastructure we're trying to incorporate into this project right now, but it's still in progress. Yeah.
Do you have any more like qualitative assessments, or are there any plans to do that? I imagine it would be a big undertaking, but I'm just curious if there's any thoughts of kind of getting more in-depth interviews with this population to see if there's any more like nuances to this.
Yeah, I think that that's a very like valid line of inquiry. I'm not trained as a qualitative researcher, and so I like to stick in my lane and stick to what I know, and which isn't to say that there's a space for other voices to be heard. I think that's definitely work that should be done, but I don't think that I am the person with the best skills to do it. So. Great. I think we're basically out of time. So thank you again, everyone, for coming and for your comments. It's a great opportunity to share my work with you.